Country music has always been built on authenticity. Real voices, real stories, and the kind of honesty that hits you somewhere deep in the chest before you even know it's coming. But somewhere between the stadium farewell tours that never quite end, the reality TV judging chairs, and the 10th album of songs that sound exactly like the 9th, something quietly got lost. These 10 artists gave us some of the greatest moments in country music history, and nobody here is taking that away from them. But right now, in this exact moment, the music isn't serving the legend anymore. The legend is just barely surviving the music. Number 10. Kenny Chesney. Picture a beach, a cold beer, a sunset that seems to go on forever. For about 15 years, Kenny Chesney owned that image completely. He made it feel real, personal, and earned. Songs like The Good Stuff, She Thinks My Tractor's Sexy, and There Goes My Life weren't just radio hits. They were the soundtrack to actual summers, actual heartbreaks, actual tailgates. He sold out stadiums year after year, moved more tickets than almost anyone in country music, and built a fan base so fiercely loyal they called themselves the No Shoes Nation like it was a religion. And for a long time, it was. Chesney grew up in Luttrell, Tennessee, a small town that shaped the everyman identity he'd carry through his entire career. He signed with B&A Records in the early 90s and spent a few lean years grinding through Nashville before When the Sun Goes Down and There Goes My Life broke him wide open. By the mid-2000s, he was competing with the biggest acts in any genre. Not just country, any genre. But somewhere around his 12th or 13th studio album, the edges started to blur. The beach songs kept coming, but they'd lost their warmth. The tropical imagery that once felt like an escape started to feel like a brand obligation. Here and Now, released in 2020, moved a few units and generated polite applause, but nobody was calling it a revelation. Nobody was pulling over on the highway to turn it up. The stadiums still fill, but they fill on memory now. On The Good Stuff and She Thinks My Tractor's Sexy, and all the songs that made people fall in love with him 20 years ago. That's not a comeback story. That's a victory lap that's been running since 2011. Kenny Chesney deserves to walk off that stage with his legacy completely intact. The longer he waits, the more each new release risks diluting the catalog he spent 20 years building. The beach will always be there, the songs will never leave, but the moment to step back gracefully, that moment is passing. Number 9. Trace Adkins. There was a version of Trace Adkins that felt genuinely dangerous. 6'6", baritone voice that could rattle the floorboards, and a presence on stage that didn't ask for your attention so much as demand it. Every light in the house, then they do. You're gonna miss this. These were proper country songs with weight and feeling behind every syllable. His 2005 hit, Honky Tonk Badonkadonk, might have been ridiculous on paper, but even that had a swagger and a self-awareness that worked. He was in on the joke and still owned the room. Adkins came out of Sarepta, Louisiana, carrying a life story that could fill 3 albums on its own. Oil rig accidents, a gunshot wound, addiction, and personal loss woven into a career that never stopped moving. Capitol Nashville signed him in the mid-90s, and by the early 2000s, he was a legitimate force on country radio. His voice alone set him apart. Deep, raw, and unhurried in a way that suggested he'd been through things and had no reason to perform otherwise. But somewhere in the last decade, the lane narrowed. The records started arriving on smaller labels with smaller budgets and smaller expectations. The singles didn't chart. The performances on reality competitions and celebrity cooking shows started outnumbering the actual music moments. His turn on Celebrity Apprentice got more coverage than most of his recent releases. And that's a troubling sign for any artist who built their identity on authenticity and grit. Trace Adkins still has the voice. That hasn't gone anywhere. On the right night, in the right venue, he can still fill a room with something real. But the musical vision that once guided those early records has drifted, and no amount of nostalgia touring fixes that. Sometimes, the most powerful move an artist can make is choosing silence over filler. Trace Adkins earned that choice a long time ago. Number 8. Tim McGraw. Not a Moment Too Soon. All I Want Is a Life. It's Your Love. Live Like You Were Dying. If you lined up Tim McGraw's peak releases end to end, you'd have one of the most consistently excellent runs in modern country history. He wasn't just charting, he was defining. Through most of the 90s and into the 2000s, McGraw combined emotional directness with just enough mainstream polish to make him inescapable without ever feeling hollow. He moved units, sold out arenas, and somehow managed to stay married to Faith Hill while both of their careers burned at full heat simultaneously. That alone should qualify him for some kind of award. McGraw was born in Start, Louisiana, and didn't discover Tug McGraw was his father until his teenage years. A story that carried real emotional weight and likely shaped the sincerity that ran through his best music. Curb Records signed him in the early 90s, and after a slow start, not a moment too soon made him a superstar in 1994. He barely stopped to breathe for the next 15 years. Then the tide shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, the singles started landing softer. Sundown Heaventown in 2014 came and went without much noise. Damn Country Music in 2015 tried to recapture something, but felt more like a mission statement than a record. His move to Big Machine and then to Sony brought label energy without artistic renewal. The most recent albums have felt like Tim McGraw going through the motions of being Tim McGraw, technically proficient, emotionally muted, and entirely safe. Safe is the enemy of legacy. McGraw's best work was never safe. It was direct and honest, and sometimes uncomfortably emotional. Live Like You Were Dying hit that hard because it sounded like someone who had actually thought about mortality. What he's releasing now doesn't sound like that person. It sounds like someone protecting a brand. That's not a criticism of the man. It's a signal that the chapter may have quietly closed, and the page is still being turned anyway. Number 7. Travis Tritt. In the early 90s, Travis Tritt was the real thing, no question. Country Club, Here's a Quarter, Trouble, and any more weren't just hits. They were declarations. He arrived with an edge that the Nashville machine hadn't quite anticipated, a southern rock influence that bled through every guitar solo and every lyric about whiskey, hard times, and getting even. He was loud, unapologetic, and brilliant at being exactly what he was. There was no performance in it. That was the gift. Tritt grew up in Marietta, Georgia, deeply influenced by Merle Haggard, Waylon Jennings, and the Allman Brothers, a combination that made him an outlier in early 90s Nashville, which was starting to drift toward a cleaner, more produced sound. Warner Brothers Records signed him in 1989, and within a year he was a genuine force. His debut album went platinum. His second went platinum twice. He won a Grammy. He was on his way to something enormous. The trouble with arriving so fully formed and so loud is that there isn't always a natural next gear. Tritt's later records became inconsistent, searching for a direction that didn't stray too far from what had worked but never quite recaptured its heat. The chart presence faded, the label deals shifted. And somewhere along the way, Travis Tritt the recording artist became Travis Tritt the touring legacy act, still drawing devoted fans who want to hear Here's a Quarter one more time, but rarely giving them anything new worth talking about. His social media presence in recent years has generated more controversy than his music has generated conversation. That ratio is never a good sign. Travis Tritt at his best was one of the most compelling presences in country music. That version deserves a clean, honorable exit, not an indefinite twilight of undersized venues and unremarked studio releases. Number 6. Billy Ray Cyrus. Let's be honest about something before we go any further. Achy Breaky Heart was inescapable in 1992, and whether that was the greatest thing that ever happened to you or a form of psychological torment depends almost entirely on your age and your relationship with line dancing. There is no neutral position on that song. You either love it the way you love an embarrassing photograph from your past, warmly, helplessly, unable to fully explain why, or you hear the first 4 notes and immediately need to leave the room. Both responses are completely valid. But here is what doesn't get said often enough because the novelty of the song has always been louder than the story behind it. Billy Ray Cyrus had a real moment, a genuine, staggering, industry-shaking commercial explosion that deserves acknowledgement before anything else in this conversation gets started. Some gave all sold 10 million copies in the United States in 1992. 10 million in a single year for a debut album from an artist nobody had heard of 12 months earlier. You can dismiss the mullet, you can mock the line dancing, you can roll your eyes at the whole cultural spectacle of it, but 10 million copies is not a novelty. 10 million copies is a phenomenon. Cyrus grew up in Flatwoods, Kentucky, the son of a politician and the grandson of a Pentecostal preacher. That combination, the instinct for performance, the instinct for conviction, probably shaped his theatrical sensibility more than any formal training ever could. Mercury Nashville signed him after years of grinding through club circuits, playing to small rooms, building something from nothing the hard way. Then Achy Breaky Heart arrived, and overnight he was everywhere: television screens, radio speakers, school gymnasium floors from coast to coast. For the better part of 2 years, Billy Ray Cyrus was impossible to avoid. Then the follow-ups didn't land. The novelty cooled, and the foundation underneath wasn't deep enough to carry the full weight on its own. The recording career faded. His name stayed in circulation through his daughter's meteoric rise, through a television show, through cameos and appearances that maintained visibility without saying anything particularly new. It was a career running on borrowed momentum, and everyone involved knew it. Then Old Town Road happened. The Lil Nas X collaboration in 2019 gave Billy Ray Cyrus the biggest chart moment of his entire career. Bigger than Achy Breaky Heart, bigger than anything. #1 for 19 consecutive weeks. A genuine cultural earthquake that nobody predicted and almost everyone enjoyed. It was joyful and strange and completely unexpected, and it landed with the satisfying feeling of a perfect final chapter. A wild, unlikely grinning exclamation point on one of the more improbable careers in modern music history. It should have been the exit. Instead, what followed was a series of controversies, erratic public moments, and musical detours that generated attention for reasons that had nothing to do with songs. The goodwill from Old Town Road wasn't infinite. It's been spent. What's left now is noise, and noise, no matter how loud it gets, is not a legacy. #5. Luke Bryan. There was a stretch between 2011 and 2017 where Luke Bryan was the biggest thing in country music. Not one of the biggest. The biggest, back-to-back Entertainer of the Year, awards from the CMA and the ACM, stadiums that sold out before the tour was even publicly announced. Country Girl, Drunk on You, Play It Again, That's My Kind of Night. Songs that dominated radio, dominated streaming, and made a certain strain of summer feel-good country completely his own. He had the voice, the look, the energy, and a charisma on stage that translated through a camera lens whether the room held 500 people or 50,000. Bryan grew up in Leesburg, Georgia, and carried a genuinely heartbreaking backstory, the loss of his brother and sister years apart, that gave his bright, party-forward music a poignancy that wasn't always obvious but was always there underneath. Capitol Nashville signed him in 2007, and by his third album, he was unmistakably a superstar. But the American Idol judging chair changed something, not immediately and not all at once, but slowly. Luke Bryan, the recording artist, started to exist in the shadow of Luke Bryan, the television personality. The albums kept coming, but the urgency left. Born Here, Live Here, Die Here in 2020 felt like an album made by someone going through the steps of making an album rather than someone who had something burning to say. The singles were polished and competent and entirely forgettable within 2 weeks of release. There's a version of this story that ends with a triumphant creative reset, a stripped-back record, a return to something personal, a reminder of why people fell for him in the first place. But that record hasn't come. And the longer he stays comfortable in the television spotlight while releasing music that functions primarily as product, the harder it becomes to hear the Georgia kid who made Drunk on You in the same man. Luke Bryan is talented enough to walk away clean. The question is whether the machine around him will ever let him try. #4. Hank Williams Jr. This one is complicated. It deserves to be treated that way from the very first sentence. There is no heavier inheritance in American music than the name Hank Williams. A father who rewrote what country music was allowed to feel, who packed more raw human truth into 3-minute songs than most artists manage in a lifetime, and who died at 29 in the back of a Cadillac before anyone had fully processed what he'd given them. That legacy doesn't just follow you, it precedes you into every room, every recording session, every single note you ever play in public for the rest of your life. That it didn't destroy Bocephus is remarkable. Genuinely, historically remarkable. Hank Williams Jr. spent his early career trying to carry the weight of his father's shadow, recording in his style, performing in his image, being presented to audiences as a continuation rather than an artist in his own right. It was suffocating, and it showed. And then, in 1975, he fell nearly 500 feet down Ajax Mountain in Montana and survived a head injury that should have killed him outright. He spent 2 years rebuilding his face and rebuilding himself, and when he came back, something had cracked open. The imitation was gone. In its place was something louder, wilder, and entirely his own. Family tradition, whiskey bent and hellbound, a country boy can survive, all my rowdy friends are coming over tonight. These weren't echoes of his father, they were a completely different animal. Southern rock grit dragged through outlaw country, unapologetic and combustible and built for people who wanted their music to feel like a declaration. He wasn't honoring the legacy anymore. He was building his own, brick by furious brick. And for a stretch of years in the late 70s and through the 80s, Bocephus was one of the most compelling figures in country music. Full stop. The mountain didn't break him. Nashville's expectations didn't break him. His father's ghost didn't break him. But the decades since those records have been something else entirely. The music released over the last 15 years has ranged from uninspired to quietly invisible. Even the most loyal fans, and they are loyal, fiercely and genuinely so, will admit in honest moments that the creative fire behind family tradition has been running on fumes for a long time. The political controversies generated headlines that drowned out anything happening musically. Losing the Monday Night Football theme after a reckless television comment cost him one of the last pieces of genuine mainstream presence he had left. What remained afterward was the touring circuit, the devoted crowds, and the old songs doing the work that new material no longer could. He is an institution now, a living monument to a rowdier, more dangerous era in country music. That institution is real, and it is earned, and it deserves enormous respect. But his father's legend stayed perfect because the music stopped before it could be diminished. Bocephus has more than earned the right to make that same choice. The only question is whether he'll take it. Number 3. Blake Shelton. Here's what gets buried under all the television noise. Blake Shelton is actually good at country music. Genuinely, legitimately good. Austin in 2001 announced him with Real Force, a debut single that didn't sound like someone finding his footing, but like someone who already knew exactly where he stood. God's Country in 2019 was even better. Raw, rooted, and quietly ferocious in a way that stopped people mid-scroll and reminded them what his voice could actually do when the material deserved it. On those tracks, and a handful of others scattered across the early part of his career, Shelton was operating at a level that belongs in any honest conversation about the best male voices in modern country music. That voice is warm, distinctive, and full of real character. It doesn't push, it doesn't perform. It just settles into a song and makes itself at home. And when the song is worthy of it, something genuinely special happens. He came up out of Ada, Oklahoma, signed with Warner Brothers Nashville, and spent the first decade of his career doing the work, building chart presence, developing instincts, earning a reputation as a solid hitmaker with a personality that translated naturally to a camera. The groundwork was real. The talent behind it was real. Then the voice happened, and the story changed, not immediately and not entirely for the worse. The show made him a household name in rooms that country radio had never reached. Millions of people who would never have found Austin or God's Country on their own suddenly knew exactly who Blake Shelton was. The television work suited him. He was clearly having fun, and that ease came through. Nobody blamed him for taking the chair. But somewhere in the middle of that run, the television personality swallowed the recording artist whole. The albums kept arriving, but they stopped meaning anything. Not because they were bad, exactly, but because they weren't trying. They didn't push the conversation forward, they didn't leave marks. They appeared, got played for a few weeks on mid-tier radio, and then quietly dissolved. By the time Body Language landed in 2021, the coverage was almost entirely about his marriage to Gwen Stefani, and almost nothing about the music sitting inside the packaging. That ratio tells you everything. When an album's cover story is more interesting than its track list, something fundamental has shifted. Blake Shelton is beloved by millions, and that affection is honest and fully earned. Nobody is taking the early records away from him. But the recording career at this point has become something closer to a formality. a way of maintaining the country star identity he carries into every other room, every other deal, every other television appearance. A placeholder, not a purpose. The voice that made God's country what it was deserves better than placeholders. So do the people who still believe in what that voice can do on the right song in the right moment, when it actually decides to show up. Number 2. Reba McEntire. This one is going to get some pushback, and it should, because the argument for Reba McEntire being one of the greatest country artists who ever lived is not a hard argument to make. Whoever's in New England, The Greatest Man I Never Knew, Does He Love You, Fancy. These are not just hits. These are cornerstone recordings, fully realized performances that showcase one of the most dramatically expressive voices in the history of the genre. She won Grammy Awards, sold out arenas for decades, built a television career, launched a fashion line, and turned herself into a brand that transcended country music entirely. The ambition and the execution were both extraordinary. McEntire grew up in Chalky, Oklahoma, on a ranch, rodeo stock running through the family, and a singing voice that started drawing attention before she was out of high school. Mercury Records signed her in the mid-70s, and after a patient, grinding early career, she found her artistic identity in the mid-80s with a string of albums that placed her firmly among the all-time greats. Her instinct for dramatic material, songs about women pushed to extremes, women fighting back, women refusing to disappear, gave her catalog a thematic coherence that most pop country never approaches. But the recent years have spread her so thin that the music has become almost incidental. The television presence is constant, the voice coaching chair, the sitcom revival of Reba, the award show hosting, the cosmetics partnerships, the Broadway appearances, and in between all of it, albums that arrive quietly and leave without much trace. Not That Fancy in 2023 had moments, but it felt like a record made in the margins of a life scheduled with everything else. There is a version of this that is inspiring. An artist still engaged, still hungry, still willing to try new things, and maybe that is what it is. But there is also a version where the sheer volume of product and presence gradually softens what once felt singular and irreplaceable. Reba McEntire's voice deserves more room than the current schedule allows it. More silence, more intention, more weight. The catalog she built between 1984 and 1994 is untouchable. The question is whether what comes next honors that standard or slowly renegotiates it. Number 1. Garth Brooks. Nobody moved the needle in country music like Garth Brooks. Nobody. Not in commercial terms, not in cultural terms, not in terms of pure ambition and execution. No Fences, Rope in the Wind, The Chase, In Pieces. These records didn't just sell. They sold at a level that put them in conversations with the Beatles, Michael Jackson, and Elvis Presley. He brought theatrical rock concert production values to country music at a time when country music was still figuring out whether that was allowed. He pointed at the sky. He slid across the stage. He exploded into the mainstream like a controlled demolition and left country music permanently wider in every direction. Brooks grew up in Yukon, Oklahoma, a student athlete who almost took a different road entirely before music pulled him to Nashville in the late 80s. Capital Nashville took a chance, and by his second album, No Fences, in 1990, the chance had become a phenomenon. He sold out stadiums, dominated charts for a decade, and briefly became the best-selling solo artist in American music history. When he retired in 2000 to raise his daughters, the gesture felt genuine, and the farewell felt earned. Then the comeback came, and then it kept coming. The return in 2014 was greeted with real excitement and genuine goodwill. A new Las Vegas residency, a new studio album, Man Against Machine, that tried to address where country music and American culture had gone in his absence. The audience still showed up in enormous numbers, because the audience had never stopped loving the man who made Friends in Low Places and the Thunder Rolls and the Dance. But the years since have been rocky in ways that go beyond music. The launch of his Ghost Tunes streaming platform failed. Public controversies around his bar and restaurant in Nashville generated national coverage for the wrong reasons. A new album, Fun, landed in 2020 to mixed reviews and rapidly fading momentum. And through it all, the tours continued. Massive in scale, nostalgic in spirit, existing almost entirely on the strength of the old songs, while the new material struggled to justify its own presence. Garth Brooks at his best understood something essential, that a country song should feel like it's happening to a real person, in a real place, with real stakes. The dance worked because it sounded like someone who had actually weighed what it means to live fully knowing that everything ends. If Tomorrow Never Comes worked because it sounded like a man who had actually thought about that question at 2 in the morning. That kind of emotional precision is incredibly rare, and it cannot be manufactured on a schedule. It cannot be packaged alongside a bar opening or a streaming platform launch or a reality competition coaching stint. It has to come from somewhere quiet and honest. The legacy Garth Brooks built between 1989 and 2000 is one of the most extraordinary achievements in American popular music. It doesn't need defending. It doesn't need additions. It doesn't need a new stadium tour to explain why it matters. It already matters. It will always matter. But the longer the comeback stretches, the more the framing shifts from one of the greatest to the one who couldn't stop. And that framing, however unfair, has a way of seeping backward through a catalog. Garth Brooks deserves better than that. The music he made deserves better than that. Walk away clean. Let the dance be the last word. Because right now, more than anyone else on this list, the distance between who he was and what's happening next is wide enough to hurt. That's our list. 10 artists who gave everything at their best, and who are now, for various reasons, in the business of spending rather than earning the goodwill they worked decades to build. This isn't about failure. It's about knowing when the last great thing you do should stay the last great thing you do. Country music has always honored the grind. But sometimes the most honest, most country thing you can do is tip your hat, walk off stage, and let the songs speak for themselves. If you want to keep the conversation going, drop your pick in the comments. We want to know who you think should have made this list. And if you want more, check out our video on the 10 greatest country albums of the 90s. Because that's where most of these careers deserve to live. Remembered right, remembered loud, and remembered at their absolute best.